Hello and welcome. We are going to get started. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar, Best Practices for End-to-End Supply Chain Due Diligence. We are excited to have two amazing speakers here with us today from Source Intelligence and SGS North America. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping. Slides and a recording of this webinar will be made available shortly after we conclude. We will send out both via email. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the GoToWebinar control panel. We will also follow up with those questions via email after the webinar concludes. You can also email questions directly to webinar@sourceintelligence.com. Some brief introductions. This is Alexandria Bennett. I'm the Business Development Director here at Source Intelligence, and I will be moderating today. We have Jennifer Kraus speaking with us today. She is the Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President of Operations and the co-founder of Source Intelligence. She has over 25 years of experience providing multidisciplinary strategic compliance, EH&S management, and management system services to customers in the U.S., Mexico, Canada, and Central and South America. Prior to co-founding Source Intelligence, Dr. Kraus was president of Global Environmental Consulting Company and an EH&S consulting practice in San Diego. Dr. Kraus was also an associate with Dames & Moore, an environmental manager at General Dynamics Electronics Division, and a safety engineer with Litton Guidance and Control System. She will walk you through best practices for collecting and validating supply chain data to determine risk. And secondly, we'll hear from Adam Whinston. He's the Director of Supply Chain Assessments and Solutions at SGS America. He is an innovative social and environmental sustainability professional, driving change in global manufacturing through implementation of creative solutions for challenging operational environments. He has led social and environmental responsibility programs at JCPenney, Hewlett-Packard, and is currently in his role at SGS North America, where he develops services to help clients monitor, evaluate, and improve conditions in global facilities to comply with regulatory requirements such as trafficking in persons FAR, UK Modern Slavery Act, California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, and conflict minerals legislation, not to mention global labor compliance standards. These customers include large retailers of apparel, footwear, furniture, electronics, and toys, as well as U.S. government contractors, universities, and other commercial enterprises. Mr. Whinston is a graduate of University of California, San Diego, our hometown, Graduate School of Global Policy and Strategy, and speaks French, Spanish, and Mandarin. So we are very pleased today to have Adam here with us. But first off, I'm going to let Jennifer take the lead. Let me pass on the presentation to Jennifer.
Well, thanks so much, Alexandria, for that great introduction. I guess the only language I can add to that is Spanish. I've got Spanish, so we've got a few languages covered here today, if need be, for our Q&A. Anyhow, very happy to be here and excited to be talking about end-to-end supply chain due diligence today, as long as being able to do so with Adam. It's a great topic. We here at Source Intelligence have spent, let's see, the last 8 years or so developing supply chain compliance programs and solutions with companies of all shapes and sizes. And it's become increasingly clear that companies are interested in completing end-to-end due diligence. It's been an exciting field for us to sort of watch grow over the last few years. You know, once we can establish a sustainable program for identifying and mitigating supply chain risks, then you're in a better position to achieve true supply chain transparency and ultimately, you know, affect change and impact ethical and social change in the supply chain. So today we're going to discuss end-to-end supply chain due diligence. And you'll see that, one of the key points I think that maybe a takeaway for you is that, developing a robust program is important, where in order to identify where the true risks lie in your supply chain. And so that's what I'm going to start off with today. Again, excited to have you, Adam, with us, and as companies like SGS are really play an integral role in end-to-end due diligence and risk management. So when we talk about end-to-end due diligence, supply chain due diligence, what are we talking about? Well, it's really a multi sort of component concept. There's the effort to ascertain, number one, whether you are compliant, not to mention whether your vendors up the supply chain are compliant, as well as your customers farther down the supply chain are compliant. So, compliance determination is a part of that, and one of the ways to ascertain compliance is collecting data and assessing those data. So, and then when we think about data acquisition, it's not just great, as you'll see in a minute here in a slide I'll share with you in a minute. It's not just acquiring the data, but it's assessing the validity and accuracy of those data. That really will enable you to make a more robust determination with regard to compliance, as well as identify other potential risks in your supply chain. Just because you're compliant doesn't necessarily mean you have no risk, right? And so then identifying those risks and truly understanding the nature of those risks will allow you to implement due diligence measures that will be effective in mitigating, if not, minimizing or mitigating those risks completely. And the last little piece is really the education, awareness, sharing information, intelligence up and down the supply chain to enable a more holistic approach to risk mitigation. We are all interconnected. Supply chains are so dynamic and interconnected that by sharing information and awareness and helping to educate entities both up your supply chain as well as down your supply chain will affect your overall risk as well. So that's sort of what we mean by end-to-end supply chain due diligence. It's really comprised of a lot of different components, both up and down your supply chain, no matter where you're located, whether you are a contract manufacturer, distributor, or a retailer, or a smelter for that matter. So anyhow, if I move down to the next slide here, you'll see that, and this is kind of a harsh term, but the fact is that there are winners and losers in this field of due diligence. Believe it or not, 65% of companies actually believe in that they're compliant. But the fact of the matter is that they are not necessarily compliant. When you think about the complexity of compliance, whether it's maintaining training records, safety plans, ISO certification to demonstrate that you've conformed to an ISO standard for a customer, quality plans, in the conflict minerals world, it's CMRTs, could be W-9s, insurance certificates, you name it, bills of lading. All of this data and information, records, documents, have to be collected, they've got to be stored, managed, reviewed, verified for accuracy and timeliness. And so it's very difficult to do that comprehensively when you look at the plethora of documents and records that are involved. And the truth of the matter is that it's easy to fall short. One certificate expires, goes past an expiration date. One supplier makes a mistake on their CMRT. So it's very challenging to have a fully comprehensive, 100% compliant program. And the other example too is, there's, and this is important to remember, I think I mentioned a minute ago, is there are a lot of these issues and topics where there is no specific standard yet or regulation that's driving the need for action. Let's take some of the topics these days, palm oil, for instance, or cobalt. You know, cobalt is a good example. So there's no Dodd-Frank Section 1502, right, that's driving the need for transparency in cobalt supply chain, so products that contain cobalt. But there is a need now for additional transparency based on you know, consumer demand for information on where these raw materials are coming from, how are they being harvested, how are they being mined, who's mining it, and so that leads to some very what can be complex topics and issues to be researched in order to demonstrate transparency. So, you know, think about what standards are part of your company's compliance and social responsibility program, or you may refer to it as a sustainability program. You know, depending on your business sector, you might be more interested in, you know, if you're in the electronics, let's say, business sector, REACH might be a hot topic, or ROS for you. Ensuring, you know, that components products are halogen free, for instance. If you're in retail or jewelry, you might be more interested in some of the you know, green chemistry topics, understanding where the gold is coming from that's going into the jewelry that you're branding or selling. So it's pretty broad. I mean, the plethora, when you really start looking deeply at the compliance topics and transparency topics that are important up and down supply chains, it's tremendous. It can be pretty overwhelming sometimes. And Adam, I think in a little bit, he's going to talk about some specific examples. Excuse me, not exams. He's already done with those. Some specific examples around the conflict minerals topic, but you know, the multitude of initiatives that are driving companies to engage their supply chain to comply with a standard or just an internal requirement can be pretty tremendous. So, you know, first understanding what's critical to your company, based on your business sector, based on your business culture, is the first step. Then figuring out how to, you know, apply that and implement that from a holistic and end-to-end perspective is the next step. So I talked about data acquisition a minute ago and how this is a pretty critical component to end-to-end due diligence. You know, you've got to, in order to mitigate risk in your supply chain, you've got to have a very clear understanding of what your supply chain looks like. Who are the business entities within that chain? Where are they operating? How are they operating? And so understanding the type of data that's got to be collected, how frequently that data needs to be collected, does that data need to be assessed for validity? You know, I'm always amazed at just the basic quality of supplier data. You know, you would think that businesses would have good, solid, robust data with regard to their supplier. Basic information, you know, points of contact, email address, physical address, or phone number. And it's challenging, you know, when supply chains are so dynamic. Company names, actually depending on where you're operating in the world, are changing all the time. There's aliases, and you know, is this the same company? The name is similar but different. You know, identifying the best point of contact for your suppliers can sometimes be challenging, but it's critical, right? In order to engage within your supply chain, in order to engage with your vendors and suppliers to gather data, you've got to know how to get a hold of them, and it can be challenging sometimes. So, that's one piece. The other is, of course, the systems, the processes, and the basic infrastructure that you've got in place to collect that data. Are you going to be using Excel spreadsheets, or are you going to be relying on a cloud-based platform, for instance, such as the source intelligence platform. So it's and there's lots of options and solutions out there. If you are interested in electronic management, is it going to be behind the firewall, in front of the firewall? But identifying and establishing the processes, the systems, and infrastructure to store, monitor data, and then allow you to assess risk based on those data is going to be critical. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that there are other sources of data outside of your direct suppliers and your supply chain. So when you think about industry working groups, can be a very helpful source of data and information. NGOs and NGOs actually can provide guidance as well with regard to the type of data perhaps that you should be collecting and looking for. They can be helpful in offering up templates or tools, for instance. Governing bodies, there may be data that is being collected and maintained by government entities. So there are, other places where you can go as a starting point, really, to help you understand perhaps, number one, what's already being collected. Number two, what should I be collecting to help me understand what my risks are. And once you understand the type of data that you need, now you can engage with your supply chain to acquire that information. So a couple of notes with regard to supplier engagement. For many supply chain compliance standards, Section 1502 is an example. You'll have to investigate what goes into the products that you're manufacturing or branding, which means you need to understand what goes into the parts and components that you are procuring from your vendors and suppliers. And so when you look at product level compliance, it's important to understand where your suppliers get their parts and components and so on up the vendor chain. So it's important to ensure that there's a consistent level of understanding with regard to what your company's expectations are with regard to ethical sourcing or social responsibility and compliance needs. And that's where you'll see policies getting implemented and shared across the board within a supply chain. You'll see terms and conditions being added to purchase orders. You'll see vendor compliance guidance documents that are shared within the supply chain. So those are all different ways to ensure that compliance and transparency expectancy is established and distributed consistently throughout your supply chain. Ensuring that suppliers and vendors that are relevant to a specific standard or regulation are also identified. It may very well be that, depending on the breadth and diversity of products that you're branding and manufacturing, there may be certain requirements that apply to some vendors and other requirements that apply to others. So, being able to parcel out or scope in and out those vendors and suppliers can be challenging, especially if you're, like most of us, you're wearing a lot of different hats, right? It could be a quality manager or a sales manager or a compliance manager or a procurement officer that is having to juggle all of these different requirements, and it can be challenging. So, and again, with regard to engagement, the more automated a system you have, the better off you're going to be. The better your supplier contact data is, the more efficient your engagement is going to be. But certainly we found that electronic engagement is by far one of the most efficient ways to engage with suppliers. But you've got to make sure that you've got a whether it's something basic like a valid email address. Is it just a general email address, info at, or customer service at, or do you actually have a real person? Jennifer Kraus at Source Intelligence. So those little things make a terrific difference in terms of the effectiveness of your due diligence efforts. So we talk about, you know, end-to-end due diligence, collecting data. You know, how bad is the situation? I guess I don't like to always focus on the negative, but I thought this was pretty impactful when we, you know, had our sort of internal data scientists start to look at data over the last few years. And I will say these statistics that I've got up here are specific to conflict minerals programs over the last couple of years. But, you know, when you look at the data information, it's pretty staggering. You know, 80%, well over 80%, almost 90% of vendor data contains errors. And we have found that vendors and suppliers that are unaware of the, you know, whether it's a regulatory requirement or internal enterprise customer requirement, we find that those unaware, uneducated vendors take almost 6 times longer to deliver the data that you're actually asking for. Again, think about that. Almost 6 times as long. That's pretty significant, especially when you're running against deadlines. Excuse me, sorry about that. The other thing is we found that 61% of vendors only collect partial data. There's, for those of you that are familiar with the CMRT, pardon me, I'm getting a frog in my throat here. We found that many of those suppliers have not collected data from 100% of their own suppliers. So that means you're only getting a partial picture. So I think these numbers are pretty staggering, and I think it also demonstrates why, pardon me, end-to-end due diligence can be so challenging, and why, you know, I'm excited about you know, opportunities to work with companies such as SGS and to bring, sort of think outside the box and come up with ways and solutions and sort of creative methodologies to be able to overcome these obstacles. So the challenge really is that, you know, with complete end-to-end supply chain due diligence, is we talked about the data side, but now what about the resources to truly develop effective end-to-end programs? Many of the companies out there are finding that it's challenging to find the right resources in-house. And even if you do, it's time-consuming to manage, to track, to assess, and identify these supply chain risks. It costs money, you know, so you may have the expertise in-house, but you may even have a solution in-house, but it takes time and money to apply that expertise and to utilize and maintain that solution. So it can be challenging, you know. And in addition, vendor supply chain compliance education starts with the you know, starts in-house with little resources, and so it might make sense where, you know, there is limited in-house expertise to you know, to consider looking outside for help, especially, and I mentioned this earlier, you know, when you look at just the plethora of data and information and documents and records that have to be managed. So you might have bits and pieces of the resources in-house, but you know, may clearly and very quickly find that it's just simply not enough. So, you know, that's where we think technology has the opportunity to change everything. It's pretty exciting to see where internal and external teams are able to collaborate on multiple initiatives at the same time for, you know, broad-based supply chain transparency and compliance efforts. It's an opportunity for you to interact cohesively, seamlessly with entities both inside your particular business as well as outside, whether they are upstream vendors or downstream customers and share, access, monitor data on a real-time basis. So put a little plug in here for the source intelligence system, but utilizing a centralized data management system will allow you to access as readily as you need to, share when you have to, push out or pull in data information when you need to. It's visualizing data. I find I'm sort of a visually oriented person. I love dashboards. So being able to establish and set up dashboards that very clearly and quickly and efficiently communicate a trend or hotspots can be invaluable. And but again, engagement with your supply chain is critical, and technology can also help overcome some of those other barriers that we talked about earlier. When you supplement that with customer support or customer service that's available on a 24/7 basis, that speaks the different languages way more than Adam and I speak, it can be a very valuable opportunity to overcome some of those barriers that we talked about. So, we find that as you gather more data from your suppliers, from your customers, relevant to various different compliance initiatives, this is how you'll start to get a better sense of where your company stands for that particular initiative or topic, that we talked about a minute ago, whether it's palm oil or relevant to a particular metal or chemical, let's say. Once you've got that at your fingertips, now you can look for inconsistencies in the data. You can compare suppliers on some very basic KPIs or other statistics around engagement or delivery or geolocation. You can look at response rates. And so these very basic data points will allow you to begin to segment your supply chain based on levels of risk. That way you can prioritize and then take a look at those, limited internal resources to begin to address those prioritized risks. And of course, comprehensive risk assessment is contingent on having the proper processes and systems in place to manage that data collection, as well as validate those data so that the conclusions that you're drawing are meaningful. So when we talk about some of the risks, what are we specifically talking about? Well, it's pretty, when you start talking about the supply chain risks, it's pretty broad-based. In the compliance field, the supply chain risks, right? It could be delivery, ensuring delivery and on-time delivery and whatnot. From a compliance perspective, it could be things as basic as just missing information or incomplete data. You may not have, if you don't have all the data, you're not going to have as complete and comprehensive a picture that you would like or need. We also see risks when information looks like it's going to fail. For example, there's a chance that a supplier could be potentially out of compliance based on the data and information that's being submitted. When you have a type of chemical or an amount of a chemical in a product that's regulated or above a particular threshold, that could be a potential for risk. It may be that a supplier is delivering to you a component with constituents that are listed on a banned substance list, for instance, by could be a country or could be your own list of banned substances. So, there's no way to know that unless you have specifically, proactively gone out and requested that data and information. Is there, the other thing is there a quality issue with regard to the data? Are you comfortable and willing to accept a statement, let's say it's a policy statement, at face value? Or are you going to, let's say, okay, my product that I'm delivering to you is conflict-free. Are you okay with accepting that statement at face value, or will you require data to substantiate it? Or will you require, in other instances, that an assessment or audit be conducted to verify that those statements, that there is data and objective evidence to substantiate that statement? So, mitigating risk in the supply chain starts with getting a very clear understanding of that supply chain first. Who are the business entities? Where are they located? Understanding the type of data that should be collected, that has to be collected, and then identifying and optimizing tools that will facilitate that data collection and allow you to assess the validity on a regular basis of that data. Technology is a great way to do that. Platform, and cloud-based analytics can provide intuitive dashboards, real-time data to make expeditious decisions with regard to sourcing, distribution, for instance. So and will allow you to pinpoint those areas of high risk in your supply chain based on that data and information. So I think those are sort of the key things that I wanted to share. I know that Adam's got some really neat stuff he wants to share with us today. So I think I'm going to perhaps pass it over to you, Ali, I think with the last thought, and that is that once you've implemented your technology options, you've identified those potential risks, red flags, let's say, that's when it becomes valuable to have a third-party testing or auditor to come in and verify, to assist with the validating, and to allow you to implement corrective actions and eventually preventive action. So I think that's a good lead into Adam. I mean, it's why we've brought SGS on today to join us, and are so grateful for you to be here, is to talk to that piece of it, to talk to that process, which is sort of allows us to get to that other end of the end-to-end due diligence. So thanks again for listening to me, and next up we'll hear from Adam with SGS, and he's going to walk you through SGS's due diligence process. So I'm going to pass the microphone along.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm really happy to be partnering with Source Intelligence on this webinar, and I'm very happy also to be partnering with Source Intelligence on our broader partnership to help our clients verify the veracity of supplier declarations. So, for those, just to start out, for those who are not familiar with SGS, I wanted to give a short intro on what we do, and then, like you mentioned, I will talk a little bit about the conflict minerals example and why there's risk in that process, the way many companies manage that, and how we can help mitigate some of that risk, and then extend that to other areas of compliance where additional verification might be necessary to check on the again, the veracity of information provided by suppliers throughout the supply chain. So for those of you who aren't familiar, SGS is the world's leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We have a comprehensive range of inspection services to help reduce risk, control quality and quantity, and meet all relevant regulatory requirements across different regions and markets. We provide a broad range of testing services around the world, so our global network of testing facilities help to reduce risk, shorten time to market, and demonstrate the quality and safety of raw materials, components, and finished products. We have certification services to demonstrate that products, processes, systems, or services are compliant with national or international regulations and standards. And then we do verification for many different industries, where compliance with the latest regulatory standard is mandatory. We help ensure that products, services, and processes follow the latest national and international standards wherever our customers are in the world. So SGS has over 80,000 employees working with customers throughout the supply chain in 11 different global industries. We operate across a network of more than 1,650 offices and laboratories around the world, and we offer global service with local expertise. So we're continuously pushing ourselves to deliver innovative services and solutions that help our customers ensure end-to-end supply chain compliance. Here are the 11 global industries where we are developing solutions, or where we have developed solutions and continue to innovate on those solutions and services that aim to help our customers move their business forward locally and globally. So you see that we work in the transportation industry, chemical, construction industry, consumer goods and retail. So all the major brands and retailers selling to end customers. Industrial manufacturing, so more in the supply chain at that point. Public sector, agriculture and food, oil and gas, mining, life sciences, and energy. So we cover a wide range of industries, and in all of those industries we do the types of things that I mentioned in the previous slides: inspection, testing, certification, and verification. So we do all those things in the supply chains and in the facilities that service those industries, or these industries that you see here on the page. In terms of the consumer retail services division, which I am a part of, we have a lab network all over the world, wherever products are being manufactured, and wherever the testing needs to be done closest to the manufacturing as possible in order to improve speed to market, so your products aren't getting held back, and they're going through that testing, inspection, audit, verification, or certification that needs to happen, so that all of that is happening as close to the source as possible. And so here are the, again, the areas in which we are working, the testing for compliance with regulatory requirements, inspections so we can check the quality at any point in the product life cycle, audits so we can look at the supplier assessments, or so we can do supplier assessments wherever they're needed in the world, and technical assistance to ensure that we have customized solutions for your specific needs, as well as sustainability services to look at the environmental, the social and environmental responsibility aspects of the manufacturing process, that's going on for the production of your products. So I wanted to talk about the conflict minerals example as a way to illustrate the need for end-to-end supply chain due diligence. Jennifer talked about how there's quite a bit of noise in the data that we receive from suppliers, and that holds true in the evaluations that we've done and the assessments that we've done throughout many of our clients' supply chain. We often see quite a bit of errors, noise. Sometimes, it's pretty obvious that there is, fraudulent data that's been communicated, things that have been kind of constructed to appear one way, even though when we get to the site and look at the processes, we find that it's not at all like that. So unfortunately, that does occur, and that's what on-site assessments are for, is to evaluate risk and to see whether the information that's been provided to a brand, retailer, or buyer is true and accurate. So, you know, the quality assurance programs exist, you know, because there are regulations that are in place to protect consumers. And as a buyer, you know, whether you are a brand, a retailer, an OEM, if you're buying product from your supply chain, you have specifications which are there to instruct the manufacturer on how to build that product, how to manufacture that product, a product that will both conform to your customers' needs and to the regulatory requirements that are in place, whether that's in the United States or somewhere else. And we have QA processes to ensure that those products are built to specification. So we use various tools to ensure that you know, that those specifications are being met, that the regulations are being you know, that the products are in compliance with regulation, and those include, you know, quality audits to ensure that the supplier can produce what we need, what you need as a buyer. Laboratory tests to ensure that you know, the product doesn't include chemicals. Raw materials inspections to make sure that the right raw materials are getting into the product at the beginning, and then inspections during production and after production to ensure that the spec has been you know, that the manufacturing has respected the specification that the buyer does want. So we have all these things in place to ensure that the product is right, but we also need similar types of processes to ensure that information that we're getting from suppliers is also true. And that's especially true when regulations are in place, you know, like Dodd-Frank, like conflict minerals, that ask buyers, issuers to report on the due diligence that they're doing in their supply chain to ensure that you know, to tell customers about the origin of raw materials that exist in those products. So in terms of conflict minerals, what due diligence looks like today is usually the issuer, the report, the conflict minerals report issuer, is querying their supply chain, but it's really just the tier one, because that's where buyers, brands, retailers, OEMs, and others have that direct relationship. So an issuer reaches out to suppliers, to that first tier, either by themselves through email or through a tool like Source Intelligence. And the suppliers are supposed to query their own supply chain, gather information about the smelters used in that supply chain, aggregate that information back, you know, for their own supply chain, complete a CMRT, and then report that back to the issuer, to their customer, the brand, retailer, OEM, or whatnot. And then what you do as a buyer, as an issuer, is you aggregate all that information across your tier one supply chain, and you create a report, a conflict minerals report, which I'm sure your legal team has a lot of say in. And then you issue a conflict minerals report to the SEC on your website, and that is what due diligence usually looks like. What due diligence probably should include is a step or multiple steps to ensure that the supplier is actually doing that, the step that we assume they're doing or hope they're doing. But as a buyer, a retailer, or OEM, you know, as the receiver of that information from your tier one, we can't ensure that they have done it by only looking at the CMRT or only looking at that tier 1. So, you know, CMRTs ideally would come from every level of the supply chain, not just that tier 1, but that is simply not practical in terms of time or the expense that that would be required in order to make that happen. So really, audits are needed to check whether tier X, you know, whether that's you've gotten to tier 1 or maybe you have had success going to tier 2, to check whether that tier, or let's just call it tier 1, whether they have queried their suppliers and have gotten responses, that they have aggregated that information for their own supply chain, put that into a CMRT, and send that to you, the issuer. The CFSP is the Conflict-Free Smelter Program, and according to their data, there is a considerable portion of the smelters for tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, the 4 conflict minerals. There's a significant portion, 10% in the case of tantalum and 40% in the case of tin, tungsten, and gold. That portion of smelters still are not part of the CFSP, the Conflict-Free Smelter Program. And one reason why could be that if their clients, you know, one level lower in the supply chain, is not requiring that they be conflict-free, then they are not going to join the program. And the reason why their clients are not requiring it is because there isn't a full check of the supply chain from the smelter down to your tier 1 and then down to you. So currently there isn't a whole lot of checking going on in the supply chain to ensure that that the information given to you is actually correct. So the tier 1s are not typically asking, what we're finding, and I'll show you on another slide, are not typically asking their supply chain consistently for smelter information. So if that if that message isn't getting back to the smelter that they need to be conflict-free or they need to join the conflict-free smelter program, then then it's going to result in excuse me, now I'm getting a frog in my throat. I think Jennifer gave that to me. Excuse me. Then you're going to find that there's a significant portion of the smelter base that that isn't participating in the program. So so what we find when we compare the CMRT responses with a third-party verification or an SGS audit of the information that that suppliers have provided in their CMRT is that there's a significant portion of those CMRTs where they actually cannot provide objective evidence that they themselves, the tier 1, have queried their supply chain and have asked for smelter information from their suppliers. So you know, we can't conclude that they've requested the smelter names. We can't conclude that they've done sufficient due diligence. They haven't, generally speaking, trained their staff on how to do these things, though they do often have a policy in place, you know, that says that they are actually doing these things. So there's a discrepancy we find in our audits between what the suppliers are telling the buyer on average. Of course, I'm not generalizing to all suppliers, but a good portion of them haven't done the due diligence that that people assume, that buyers assume is being done. So when I talk about an audit, what does that mean? What does an audit consist of? What it really is you know, we're looking for 3 main things. The audit usually takes 1 day because we go into detail on these topics and cover them in detail. But we're really looking for whether the company has a policy. Does the supplier have a conflict mineral policy that matches the client's requirements? So, as a buyer, as a brand, a retailer, OEM, whatever type of company you are, and you're asking your suppliers to institute a policy and program that corresponds to your own conflict minerals policy, do they have a policy that matches your requirement? The second thing is, have procurement personnel receive training on conflict minerals policy, and have they implemented the policy in their procurement practices? So, is there a log? Are there training documents? Is there a training log that shows that people actually, participated in that training? Did they take a short test to see whether they remembered any of what they learned in that training? Is there any type of evidence of that? And then, most importantly, is the looking through the emails or any other correspondence they might have had with their supply chain to see whether any correspondence can corroborate the declaration on the CMRT. So is there objective evidence that suppliers have provided smelter-related information gathered from their supply chain? And what other way, either using the source intelligence tool, have they done it through something like that, which makes it a whole lot more transparent, or have they done it through email, or have they done it through similar tools? But is there objective evidence that corroborates the information, the declaration that they've made on that CMRT? And like we said, unfortunately, in the case of conflict minerals, there's quite a big gap in what suppliers are declaring versus what they're actually doing. So the question is, do I need to do this for all my suppliers? And the answer is no. In the case of conflict minerals, you only need to do this where you have high risk. And where you have high risk is for those suppliers that are reporting that they're using conflict-free smelter certified smelters, or conflict-free smelter program certified smelters. So if they're saying on their CMRT that they are conflict-free because they're using a conflict-free excuse me, that they're using a smelter from the conflict-free smelter program, then that's the one that you need to check. So it's a little counterintuitive. So I would just want to go through this real quick. There are 4 types of responses that you could get from a supplier for conflict minerals. You could get no response. In some of the cases, maybe 5 to 10 or more % of your suppliers don't even respond to your request for information, either through source intelligence, a similar tool, or by email from you directly. They say that it's not applicable, that they produce a product that doesn't have conflict-free, that doesn't have those those materials in it. And that's easy to check because your engineers will know generally whether, or your product designers will know whether there's that material in the product, or it should be in the product. So if they say it's NA, and you know it actually isn't scope, then you follow up with them and set them straight. They could say that they're using a non-CFSP smelter, and if your policy states that they need to be using CFSP smelters, then you know how to handle that too. You write them back and you say you need to change your procurement practices and to procure to make sure that your supply chain is using only CFSP smelters. But it's this last one where they tell you that a CFSP smelter is being used, which could result in the inclusion in your report, or the creation of a report which has misleading or possibly risky information in it, which you'll be providing to the U.S. government. which is something that compliance officers want to avoid. So that in that bottom right-hand corner, that's the one where you have risk, and those are the ones, those suppliers that tell you that they've looked through their supply chain, they've queried their suppliers, and the result is that they're using a CFSP smelter. Those are the ones where you want to check that out. So who should do this? NGOs are catching wind of some of the holes in the OECD best practice guidance, and are going to be criticizing, especially those who say that they are conflict-free. So if you want to get ahead of that NGO criticism and do additional due diligence in your supply chain to get ahead of that, then this is a good way to to eliminate some of that risk. If you want to set yourselves apart from your competition, you have customers who you think are particularly tuned in to this issue, then you would want to do that. If you yourself doubt the quality of the data that you're being provided, then this is for you. If you want to have higher confidence in the public report that that you're writing to the SEC and that's posted publicly on your website, then this is something you could want to consider. Like I said before, if you're declaring DRC conflict-free, then this is definitely something that you should consider very strongly, through a third party. If not SGS, then someone else. So if you're going to be saying that publicly that you are DRC conflict-free, then just looking at your Tier 1 is definitely not sufficient. If you want to have an additional way to measure your supplier's commitment to you, this could be something that you could put on the supplier dashboard, like a balanced scorecard. Just as you evaluate them on price, quality, time to delivery time, availability of supply, those types of things. This would be another one. Are they truthful in their statements to you? And that could be an indicator of how much business, or if you want to do business with them at all. And most importantly, there's a lot of money being spent on conflict minerals programs and compliance with Dodd-Frank, and the same will be done in the UK, or for anybody who's exporting product to the UK. There's personnel involved, there's software involved, there's a lot of money that's being spent on these things, and generally speaking, people don't want to waste their money. So it's a good thing to check whether the information you're getting is actually true. So I talked about applications. I said at the beginning I wanted to extend this to topics beyond just conflict minerals, and the same process can be used in other areas, like in general social compliance audits, human trafficking, due diligence, quality management system assessments, security assessments, and Jennifer also mentioned, for instance, REACH, ROS, and other sustainable products compliance programs like palm oil and other things. So anytime that you're getting self-assessed data from your suppliers, there needs to be an evaluation that happens on your end, or on if you want the help of an SGS or a source intelligence, or in combination, to look at whether there's any risk in the information, or risk of either untruth or just maybe not the complete story in that questionnaire. You need to look at whether an on-site assessment at a portion of that group, an on-site assessment to determine whether some of those statements might have been misleading and could lead you to the wrong conclusions about the level of risk in your supply chain. So, for the case of human trafficking, for example, the Federal Acquisition Regulation requires that for all federal contractors, that there not be any human trafficking in your supply chain, and that flows down from your tier 1 to their tier 1, your tier 2, and so on and so forth, all the way down, really all the way up the supply chain in this case. So the suppliers that the subcontractors that you might be using, the subs that they're using, the suppliers that are in their supply chain, all of those should be free of human trafficking according to the federal acquisition regulation. And if your contract with the federal government is large enough, and if you're sourcing from overseas or providing a product or service overseas, then you automatically fall into the bucket of needing to supply your government procurement agent with a declaration and a compliance plan. Now, you could query your tier 1 and ask them, ask them questions that could lead you to a conclusion about whether there's human trafficking in their facilities or in their supply chain. But again, if that information isn't verified, then it could be a risk. And if you're taking that information and using it to make a declaration, or using it to certify to the federal government that there is no human trafficking in your supply chain, then that you're taking on a considerable amount of risk if there is no checking going on of that information that's being supplied by your tier 1 or your tier 2. So just a couple minutes on what the SGS supply chain audit program looks like. We do quite a number of different programs that go from very industry specific to less industry specific, country specific to non-country specific, and those include the EICC program, Ethical Trade Initiative, RAP, SEDEX, and everything in between, pretty much. Responsible jewelry, ICTI is for toys, and so we audit to all types of social standards. I guess we shouldn't say schemes in the U.S. Schemes, I guess, is a word for standards in the U.K., but we'll call that social assessment standards. And then we have a highly qualified pool of auditors. In our consumer and retail division within SGS, we have over 700 auditors, and they're all university educated. They have backgrounds in various types of social responsibility auditing, and they have work experience in the industry that is relevant to the audit that they're performing. A large number of them also have quality management system experience. They have environmental health and safety experience, security experience, and then they have additional qualifications. Obviously, the more and more qualifications a person has, the fewer of them there are, and the same is true with our base. So a few people can do everything, and a large number of our auditors are very, very specific about what they can do and hold degrees and experience in that vertical. Our auditors also go through a rigorous training process that combines classroom and in-field training to ensure that they're learning what they need to learn. If they need supplemental training, and that they're being shadowed by an experienced auditor in the field, so that they're not going out by themselves, or they're not even auditing on a team until they're completely prepared for what they could face in the field. And then just to show you, the growth in audits continues to rise in East Asia. Southeast Asia is growing also, but quite a lot of growth happening in Europe, in Latin America, and still in South Europe also. Where we're beginning to see a lot of activity is in the Horn of Africa, where manufacturing in Ethiopia and surrounding countries is really taking off as well. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with kind of the audit pipeline, this is how it works. We receive a request from you, the buyer, to conduct an audit. We go ahead and send a quotation and get prepayment. We execute the audit on site. We issue a finding summary report and then a final report due 22 days after the initial request was made. So, about 3 to 4 weeks, within 3 to 4 weeks, we have results of that on-site audit, which will help you determine whether the information that you received from them is true or not. When the auditor is on site, they follow the standard ISO auditing practice of having an opening meeting, doing a tour of the facility, meeting with various management after they review certain documents and records. They meet with management, they meet with workers, they do worker group interviews, additional on-site observation to corroborate any information they might have learned, anything they might have learned from those interviews, and then they do a management briefing and a closing meeting at the end to ensure that management knows what those findings are, so they're not surprised by the report when they receive it a few days later. And then the corrective action process. So say, for example, we go to a facility that has told you they are sourcing from, or their suppliers are sourcing from conflict-free smelters, but we find that they actually haven't queried their suppliers. There's no evidence that they have. There's no evidence that they've done any training. What we will do is provide them with a corrective action plan template, which they can complete within a few days. So the facility submits that corrective action plan, SGS approves the plan, and then the facility goes about implementing that corrective action. When they're finished implementing that, they can send us evidence that that corrective action has been made, either a copy of a policy or training records or email correspondences or evidence that if you're using a tool like Source Intelligence, that they are now using that type of tool to gather information from lower tiers in the supply chain. SGS can evaluate that and then send a letter of compliance to them and let you know as a buyer that those non-compliances had been corrected. So, in conclusion, supplier submitted information needs to be checked for high-risk suppliers. Again, I'm not suggesting that audits need to be done for your entire Tier 1. That would be too costly and too time-consuming. What I am suggesting is that on-site audits or desktop audits, which I didn't talk a whole lot about, but can also be useful, they can be used to verify the information provided from suppliers who you consider to be high risk. And in the case of conflict minerals, I defined high risk as those who say that they are sourcing or their suppliers are sourcing from conflict-free smelter program certified smelters. So this isn't something that should be used across all of your suppliers, but very specifically and in a very targeted way, so you can have more or a higher level of confidence in the information that you're getting back. And so, the Source Intelligence platform combined with SGS audit capabilities give you a greater confidence in the information that your suppliers provide you. And that's what we're really trying to do, is give you a way to ensure that you have confidence in the information that you're receiving whether that's for conflict minerals, whether that's for REACH or ROS, whether that's palm oil, or any other type of information that you've solicited from your suppliers, they're providing that information without without a check. What we're saying here, obviously, is that in some cases, or in many cases, a check is quite valuable. So thank you very much for your for listening, and I'll hand it back over to Allie.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Jennifer, for also presenting today. A lot of great information. I hope everyone on the call has will find this information presented valuable to your supply chain compliance programs and can utilize best practices that were presented today. Just as a reminder, if you joined us late and as a midway point, a recording of this webinar and slides from the presentation will be emailed to you shortly after we conclude, once we wrap up the recording and get that on our website. And we will gladly answer any questions that were asked through the GoToWebinar control panel or via email. If you email education@sourceintelligence.com, and we will respond. For any additional resources, I highly recommend you check out our white paper and webinar library at sourceintelligence.com. Lots of valuable information on the site. We bring in speakers like Adam from SGS and among many other industry leaders to present information that will help you in your efforts, in your supply chain compliance efforts. So definitely take a look at that and utilize that as a resource. That's it. This is Alexandria Bennett with Source Intelligence. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.